All right, let's take a look at section 5 here. And this is the focus question. As colonial America matured, an elite emerged that increasingly dominated politics and society, although it was not as powerful or wealthy as England's aristocracy. The gap between rich and poor probably grew faster in the 1700s than in any other period in American history. In New England, growing trade created a powerful merchant upper class, often linked by family or business connections to London's great trading firms. With no banks in America, success often depended on the credit to be had from personal connections. By 1750, colonies of the Chesapeake and Lower South were dominated by slave plantations producing tobacco, rice, and other staple crops, and by the enormously wealthy planters who owned them and ruled these colonies' governments. Even though colonial America had no titled aristocracy or legally established social ranks as Britain did, men of families with a growing landed and commercial wealth came to control much of the colony's political, economic, and social life. 18th century Virginia was a far healthier environment than in the earlier period, and planters could expect to pass on their holdings to their sons, establishing dynasties. Nearly every Virginian of note achieved prominence through family connections. Before the American Revolution, there was no real American identity, and the term Americans tended to be used to describe Indians rather than colonists. Many European immigrants maintained their traditions, including the use of languages other than English from their home countries. Those from the British Isles sought to create a dominant English identity in the New World. This involved convincing Britons that the colonists were like themselves. Many in Great Britain, however, saw the colonists as a collection of convicts, religious dissidents, and impoverished servants. Many colonists insisted that British identity meant allegiance to certain values, among them free commerce and English liberty. British identity in the colonies was defined, in part, in opposition to others, including Spanish and French Catholics, Africans, and Native Americans. In the Spanish and French New World empires, Indians were incorporated into a collective identity. However, since most Indians preferred to maintain their own cultures and religions, the colonists of British North America did not include them in a collective colonial identity. In this period, the different colonies were more strongly connected to England than to each other. In a process that historians call Anglicanization, they soon came to see themselves as more English than American. Wealthy colonists imitated emerging British fashions in taste and behavior, consumption and architecture, and often sent their children to Britain for their education. Many, desperate for an aristocratic lifestyle, fell into debt, but as long as the tobacco market thrived, so did the gentry. The wealthiest colonists of the British mainland were South Carolina planters. Charleston, where elite South Carolinians spent most of their time when not summer vacationing in the north, was the only actual urban center south of Philadelphia. Aristocratic lifestyles flourished, and the wealthy surrounded themselves with uniformed house slaves. Per capita wealth was more than 4 times that of tobacco areas in Virginia and 8 times that of Philadelphia or Boston. The richest 10% owned half the wealth in 1770, while the poorest quarter owned less than 2%. Throughout the colonies, the elite emulated what they perceived as a balanced and stable English social order. Liberty was associated with the power to rule through webs of influence linking patrons and dependents, with each carrying specific responsibilities reflected by dress, manners, and the splendor of homes. Images of refinement served to legitimize the wealth and political power of colonial elites who prided themselves on aristocratic characteristics. On both sides of the Atlantic, work was viewed as the reserve of commoners and enslaved people. Alongside wealth, poverty increasingly became part of the colonial life in the 18th century America. Fewer free colonial Americans were poor compared to Britain, where 1/4 to 1/2 of all people required public assistance. But enslaved people lived in impoverished conditions, and the number of poor without property grew with diminishing land and the growth of wage labor. Better off colonists generally viewed the poor as lazy and responsible for their own poverty, and while rural communities and cities gave some assistance to their own, they prevented the unemployed and propertyless newcomers from receiving aid. To minimize the burden on taxpayers, the poor were often sent to workhouses that produced goods to reimburse authorities for their upkeep, and children were assigned to apprenticeships. Strict measures were enacted to warn out unemployed and propertyless newcomers, often families headed by widowed or abandoned women. Most free Americans were members of the middle ranks, living between extremes of wealth and poverty, and the vast majority of these were small farmers. The wide distribution of land and the economic autonomy that went with it distinguished colonial America from Europe. Perhaps 2/3 of the free male population owned their own land, while 3/5 of England's population owned no property at all. By the 1700s, colonial farm families viewed land ownership as a kind of right and the social precondition of freedom, and they strongly resented the efforts by Native Americans, great landlords, or colonial governments to limit their access to land. Their dislike of personal dependence and their understanding of freedom as not relying on others for a livelihood sank deep roots in British North America and to a great extent reflected social reality for many white colonists. The family was the center of economic life in the 18th century American household economy. Most work revolved around the home, and men, women, and children all contributed to the family's well being. The small farmer's independence depended to a great degree on the work of his dependent wife and children. While most farmers first focused on growing food to survive, as commerce expanded in the 18th century, increasing numbers of farmers also produced for the market. Women were constantly at work raising children and working in the home by cleaning, cooking, sewing, and engaging in other activities, as well as working in the fields. Women's workload increased in the 18th century despite the introduction of new consumer goods that replaced items previously made at home. As society became more structured, women's opportunities receded compared to the earlier period. Lower infant mortality meant more domestic responsibilities, while the demand for new goods made available by the burgeoning Atlantic trade required all family members to contribute to the household income. So that's the end of section 5.